Okay, well, welcome to this UK and a Changing Europe lunch hour on shared challenges, diverging views, UK, US, and EU foreign policy. And we're really straddling the globe with this discussion because our panelists are sitting in Washington, Brussels, as well as in London, in the UK. So let me just introduce them briefly. Rosa Balfour is the director of Carnegie Europe. She is a long-standing expert on European politics, institutions, and foreign and security policy. And if you haven't looked at any of her commentary on Gaza, Ukraine, and so on, I'd encourage you to do so. And a particularly interesting piece recently on the blind spots of realism, I think, which you can pick up from the Carnegie Europe site. Simon Fraser. So Simon Fraser is co-founder and managing partner of Flint. From 2010 to 2015, he was head of the UK Foreign Office and the Diplomatic Service, obviously running the UK's foreign policy. And prior to that, he was permanent secretary at the UK Department for Business, which was in the aftermath of the financial crisis. So a big job of work there. And lastly, but by no means least, is Constanze Stelzenmüller, who's director of the Center on the United States and Europe, and is also the inaugural holder of the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Challenges, all of those at Brookings. And many of you will have read Constanze's work and a great piece recently on the US and Germany in the Financial Times on and risk owning Ukraine stalling war efforts. So great panel, and I'm absolutely delighted that we get to spend time with them. So we're going to kick off with a kind of state of play from across the Atlantic from Constanze, then come back to Europe to hear from Rosa, and then to Simon. So Constanze, over to you.
Well, first up, thank you for this invitation. It's lovely to see old friends. Richard, you and I think, haven't met in ages, but thank God for the pandemic and the fact that it brought the Zoom era to us. Well, as for sitting in Washington, there is an overall feeling of Groundhog Day here, meaning that there is a dreadful sense of déjà vu about what is unfolding here. You have an administration in the Biden administration that is, I think, despite some initial missteps in its first 6 months, and I'm referring, of course, to the AUKUS debacle and the even greater disaster of the Afghanistan withdrawal, I think has managed overall extremely competently to manage the Western support for Ukraine. That is having, somewhat understandably, I would say, a harder time now managing the unfolding Israel-Gaza conflict. But in general has been administration in which many Europeans sort of recognize competence, rationality, a sense of strategy, and above all, a very sophisticated sense of how geopolitics and geoeconomics work in an age of growing interdependence and what that means for the transatlantic relationship. I have not in my career seen an American administration that has so openly and actively acknowledged the importance of the European Union and of Europeans as leverage for American purposes and strategy. Right? And then on the other hand, you have an unfolding presidential campaign, which at least in large parts appear, and I'm not talking just about the American hard right, appears to be based on an entirely different sense of reality. Not just of a different sense of American purpose, of whether America should be more or less engaged with the world, but on a notion that all nations, and especially large nations, are completely sovereign in world affairs, are in no way in need of allies, should ditch alliances, and can in general shape geoeconomics to their will. And that is what makes this circumstance rather different, or sort of rather difficult to navigate. And I will finish with stating the obvious, which is that the core aspect of this sense of déjà vu is the growing dread in Washington and elsewhere that a GOP candidate called Donald J. Trump is not just ineluctable, but that he stands at least a 50% chance of becoming the country's next president, which would have, I think, consequences for foreign and security policy that would, this time around, go far beyond what we saw the last time, not least because this presidency is being a lot better prepared by many more people. They've been somewhat quieter on their ideas on foreign and security policy, but you can derive them, and increasingly there are analysis pieces that lay out in some detail what a second Trump administration would do in foreign and security policy. And it's no surprise to any listener that it would not be good news for Europe. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Constanze. There's an awful lot to get into there, and I'm tempted to start firing questions at you, especially some of your provocations, I think, in terms of getting us to think about what the future might hold. But I'm going to turn to Rosa first, if I may, to get the view from inside the Brussels Beltway.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And the sort of shadow of Trump becoming elected really hangs over Europe as well. I think in terms of horizons, most diplomats are working on the next year time horizon, precisely because of the uncertainty of what's going to happen in the US. And of course, a different president would have massive implications for Europe. But of course, Europe also has its hair-raising politics. So that is the context in which European diplomats need to operate. There were elections in the Netherlands just a few days ago that resulted in the shock that a far-right Eurosceptic party actually turned out to be the largest, got the most votes. And of course, there will be elections in 2024 in the European Parliament, but also in other European countries. So that is the constant daily grind of trying to manage the differences and the problems that the politics in Europe pose on foreign policy. But on foreign policy, the challenges are not going away. So what are they? I mean, the first is the obvious, what Europeans call their neighborhood. So what's happening in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and of course what's happening in the Middle East with the Hamas-Israel war. And in the short term and in the long term, this is really what EU foreign policy is going to be dealing with. In the short term, it means maintaining the commitment towards Ukraine, maintaining the flow of ammunition and military support, which is increasingly challenged, maintaining the financial commitment, which is again increasingly challenged by politics within the European Union. But in the longer term, it's the project of enlargement. So the EU has, in December, will need to decide whether to start accession talks with Ukraine, Moldova. There is a roadmap ahead. It's going to be a massive and daunting challenge that will require a lot of change in the countries that plan to join the EU, not least end a war, but also it's going to require lots of changes in the European Union, a lot of reform. So it's going to require a lot of political commitment. On the Middle East, the High Representative has just been you come back from a round trip. There's a lot of commitment. There's a lot of commitment to support a political process through diplomacy and through aid. And of course, there is a fear that an expansion of the conflict, a spillover of the conflict into the region, will also directly affect European interests and Europe's security. as well. But this is an area where the EU is probably less influential than the United States. So we'll see a bit of alignment with the United States so long as the Biden administration is there. And then I'd like to add, if I may, just two buckets of challenges, shall we say. And the first relates very much to what Constanze was saying about the alignment between economics and foreign and security policy. This is, I think, there's less of a clear view in the European Union than there is in the United States, where you have this amazingly clear essay by Jake Sullivan, who's really outlining what a foreign policy should look like. But this is where the EU needs to update and upgrade and refine its tools. It's about Europe's economic security. It's about protecting the single market. It's about finding a balance between what Europeans call open strategic autonomy, so having open relations with the rest of the world, but at the same time acknowledging that economics there's a security element, a security dimension to that as well. And this will affect relations with the US looking forward. Again, if there's a change of government in the United States, the EU and the US will end up being far less aligned than they are now, and even now it's difficult. And of course, with respect to China and US-China rivalry. So that's a second bucket of issues. And then the third bucket is I think the European Union has a massive credibility problem with respect to the rest of the world. Woke up very late to it, started to wake up to it when Russia invaded Ukraine. But I don't see that it's preparing itself for addressing this in a comprehensive way, and in a way that is mindful of those perceptions that exist in the rest of the world of Europe. But it's certainly an area that will need to be addressed, precisely in the name of developing partnerships and creating alliances that Constanze was referring to earlier. It's clear that the EU cannot navigate this world alone, and therefore it needs to have partnerships. But the credibility problem, which has been exposed yet again with respect to the Israel-Hamas war, I think it runs deeper than a lot of European diplomats are willing to acknowledge.
Thanks, Rosa. Just one follow-up point. Constanze spoke about the way that the Biden administration is the most attuned that she saw as far as the EU is concerned. I mean, is that the same take in Brussels, do you think?
Yes, very much so. I mean, I actually think they've been quite in lockstep on a lot of things. I think, for instance, the word de-risking, which was first used by Ursula von der Leyen in her speech on China, a week later, the Americans were using de-risking. Until 2 weeks ahead, they were using decoupling. That is a convergence which I think was planned, because there is a very good relationship between Brussels and Washington. They work very well together on sanctions, and also with the UK actually on this particular matter. I think have made as best use as possible of this window, this 4-year window, to try and lock the relationship in. There still are, more boxes that need to be ticked, more conversations that are taking place, artificial intelligence. There's a lot happening there, but yes, I definitely think that the level of coordination has been quite unprecedented, and has achieved a lot. It's never enough, because it's as I said, a short window. It's been 3 years now. We've got 1 more year to go, but that is what's happened over the past few years.
Great, thank you very much, Simon. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I agree with a lot of what has been said, but when I look at it from the UK perspective, the first thing I want to say is I think sort of UK foreign policy is really still in recovery from the events of the last 8 years, and this is a long process. We have a government that is strongly focused on its domestic agenda. It's a weak government that is divided. The party is divided, and we have a prime minister who has very little experience in foreign policy, and hasn't demonstrated so far, I would say, huge talent for it. And we've had a series of rapidly changing and, in some cases, rather bizarre foreign ministers. So we're in a process of really recovery and realignment after Brexit, and foreign policy is still hampered, of course, by the politics of Brexit. Now, having said that, I think there has actually been a very credible attempt to create a coherent view of an overall set of international policy priorities through the UK's integrated review and the refresh of that integrated review. And at an intellectual and conceptual level, they've done a pretty good job of identifying new threats and new opportunities and setting out a fairly sophisticated approach to international challenges, and then following them through and demonstrating activity, for example, in COP26 and recently in the AI summit. So there are certainly some upsides, and that thinking has been pursued in a number of policy areas which are consistent with it. So you've seen a toughening of policy towards China, although that can be sometimes uneven. You've seen engagement in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region, for example, through the AUKUS initiative and through the membership of CPTPP. You've seen strong UK support and positioning on Ukraine in keeping with consistent support for democracy in Eastern Europe, NATO, and a fairly hardline anti-Russian position. You have seen alignment with the US administration of Biden, as Rosa and Constanze have discussed, and that's been true on our side as well. And you've seen ongoing support for the international system, the G7, the UN, and the WTO, at least in words. So, there have been some fairly consistent positions, but that performance has also been patchy. So we've had a reduction of the UK's aid budget at the same time. We've got a gaping hole, really, in our foreign policy still in relation to our cooperation with the European Union and how we're going to build that forward. We've seen a bit of a weakening of the UK's leadership on climate more recently. Mm-hmm. I think we've seen a fairly uncertain handling of the Gaza crisis in its early stages on the UK side, although that's improved. And of course, we've seen a perceived weakening on a number of fronts linked to immigration policy and other things of the UK's actual commitment to international law and respect for treaties, including, of course, in relation to the Brexit negotiations, which must have some sort of reputational impact. So, it's a mixed agenda, it's a mixed report in a way, as the UK seeks to position itself. But the fundamental problem for the UK is the question of credibility and leverage in a world where you have the US, the EU, and China as major sort of political, military, or economic powers, and the UK seeking to find its position in that scenario. Just one final point from me. And that is that we are now a year out from an election in the UK, as there will be elections elsewhere next year, both in Europe and in the US. The likelihood here is that we are going to have a Labour government, probably, let's say a year from now. I don't actually think that that is going to foreshadow a very significant shift in British foreign policy. I think it will largely be a policy of continuity, but there will be some areas of nuance. And the big question, of course, will be in relation to the relationship with the European Union and how Labour is able, and whether Labour is able to put into effect its commitment to move further and faster in restoring not only the trade, but also the political security and foreign policy relationship with the EU. The other thing to say is that at roughly the same time as that Labour government comes in, or shortly after it, we will see the American election and the potential arrival of Trump too. And if that were to be the case, that would pose some very tricky early positioning questions for a new Labour government in the UK in relation to the US. I'll pause my introductory comments there.
Thanks very much, Simon. I mean, we have a fascinating future ahead, but I want to stick with the present first, if I may, and just to come back to you, Simon, and ask you to say something, if you're willing to, on the relationship between the current UK government and the Biden administration, how you see sort of transatlantic relations, and then maybe come back to Rosa and to Constanze after that, really to get your sort of take on the UK, if you like, and where you see whether the UK has done this job of establishing or re-establishing what Simon called credibility and leverage. So Simon, back to you first.
Well, I mean, on the relationship with the Biden administration, I would agree with what Constanze and Rosa said, and I think the UK has sought to cooperate closely with the Biden administration. And I think that the perception in this country is very much that this is an administration which has reached out to its allies, which has collaborated pretty effectively with allies, obviously over Ukraine, where actually, frankly, we Europeans need to acknowledge the debt that we have to the US for its security leadership in that area. But also, of course, within that context and extending that context, in restoring some degree of confidence amongst NATO allies about the US position and commitment there. And then actually this administration has reached out in a constructive way to build new networks of relationships in the region around China, reaching out to partners there. And the UK has found that, I think, a positive development and has sought to align with it. So broadly speaking, I would say that I share the view that has been expressed by others that this is seen as an administration which has performed well in relation to its allies. I mean, there are some areas, however, where I think we have more reservations, and that would apply, for example, to the Inflation Reduction Act and the way that was introduced in a way which the European Union and the UK also found very difficult to cope with and respond to, and which clearly is having an effect of changing investment patterns quite dramatically in areas, very important areas of new technology towards the US and out of Europe, which is quite problematic for us, and we need to respond to.
Thanks, Simon. Rosa, to you on the UK.
On the UK,
yeah.
Listen, once the Windsor framework was reached, the sigh of relief on part of European diplomats was huge. The tensions, the unpredictability of the British government, especially during under Johnson and Liz Truss, and the threat of tearing up international law for Europeans, that was very difficult. So yes, sigh of relief, but I have to say that in these years of negotiating Brexit, two things. The first is that the EU discovered it has teeth when it comes to protecting the single market. And then the second is they discovered that, especially with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that they could actually unite on a foreign policy issue. Now, that unity didn't last very long. We saw what happened with Hamas and Israel. But nonetheless, this feeling that actually they could manage it, notwithstanding the fact that Britain had left. So in a way, during this process, from 2016 up until negotiating the Windsor framework, while there is a lot of goodwill and there is a hope that the next government will want to deepen relations with the EU, will want to find out more what areas are fertile ground for cooperation, including on foreign and security policy. But at the same time, there also is, the UK is not on everybody's lips any longer. The EU has moved on in a sense, which is a real shame because, if there is going to be a Labour government, I think the olive branch will be offered. And there might just be a slightly waning interest in picking that up, or in deepening relations. Given it's also a question of bandwidth, etc., etc. Obviously, if Trump were to become the US president, I think that would change things completely. I think there would be a huge incentive for the EU and the UK and others to team up more strongly. But failing, if that were not to happen, and if we were to have, Biden administration, which has been so pro-European, I mean, the first trip was to Brussels, Biden's first trip was to Brussels. I think Europeans have actually quite enjoyed that attention.
Thanks, Rosa. So, Constanze, how stands the UK's credibility and leverage in Washington at the moment?
It's a good question. I think the administration has immensely appreciated the UK's very forward-leaning role on Ukraine, as I might say, have I. And I think other people who think like me in the German sphere, at least. That's been greatly welcomed, both in terms of intelligence, but also providing training and other sort of more specialized capabilities to Ukraine, including in some cases in Ukraine, I think. But there is, of course, a sense that a UK that is no longer in the EU, where it unquestionably, more often than not, punched above its weight, is a diminished UK, right? There is also a sense that the UK, like so many European economies, not excluding my own German one, is struggling with necessary transformations, is struggling with sometimes quite fundamental provision of governance, which in turn is giving fuel to anti-democratic forces within our political systems. We all have that issue. That I think undercuts the weight of a lot of European countries right now, as it does, I mean, in the self-perception of decent democratic Americans, does the rise of the hard right in this country, right? I think that it diminishes us all. And what's, I mean, I'm going to quote my dad here, if I may. My dad, who was drafted as a 16-year-old in 1944 into the Wehrmacht reluctantly, and who used to say to me, we can trust the Americans and the Brits never to do the kind of stupid shit that we did. And my dad's no longer with us, but I often think of that. There was an assumption for decades, and certainly when I was growing up, that Great Britain was simply immune to illiberal temptations. And it turns out that all of us struggle with this. And I think it's a response to the complexities of governance under conditions of deep interdependence and losing, and a sense in the general public that the people who represent us are losing control, and a deep desire to find leaders who at least project the sense that they are in control, even if that turns out to be illusionary in the end. Sorry, that was a somewhat longer answer than you wanted, I suppose.
No. It was great, and actually, I wanted to pick up on this issue of control, if I may, and government's ability to deliver, but how it ties into what you each touched on, which is sort of economic strategy, and how across the Atlantic and across the North Sea, there are different responses to the sort of geoeconomic situation. Biden's gone big on the IRA, and as Simon said, I mean, that creates problems for the allies of the US as much as it does for the US's competitor. And I wondered whether we could stick with this for a moment and just to hear from you whether you really see it, this sort of economic security agenda, reshoring, strategic autonomy, open or closed in the economic sense, the kind of things that are in the integrated review in terms of the UK science and technology base. I mean, are these things that are sort of pulling allies apart, or are they things that are drawing them together? Maybe kick off with Rosa this time, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, negotiating there are a lot of risks in this geo-economic approach, which is putting, well, as you know, Jake Sullivan puts it, the foreign policy for the middle classes. This is to rejuvenate a certain class that has been the prime target of the emergence of the far right, and therefore we need to address this class. I mean, we're talking, talk about social class, and the only way to do it is double down on production and on trying to revamp the economy. And it doesn't have a trades component. So I think for Europe, there is a lot of clarity in the vision from Jake Sullivan's point of view. I think for Europe, this is a lot more challenging because the whole project of European integration has been very much based on building mutual interdependence, trade, building the single market, and therefore not creating barriers, but having as open as possible economy, mutual recognition, and to pursue that also in foreign economic relations through trade deals. And the degree to which this was done in a technocratic way in Europe, in the EU, in the European Union, is demonstrated by the fact that the member states gave the competence to the Commission, who negotiates trade deals with third countries. When you start including elements, be it of subsidy or protection, because we have both in Europe, both subsidized models, but also protection models, such as CBAM, for instance, then you start challenging some of those principles vis-a-vis partners. And I think that this is a bit of it's not necessarily a dangerous route, but it's a controversial route, and it's a difficult one to navigate. Because then you go back to questions about in whose interests are you doing this? And that's why I was referring to the credibility problem, because if you focus too much internally and you're not reaching out to your partners, you have a problem of international credibility. Whereas I think in Europe, the social dimension, the class dimension, the foreign policy for the middle classes is slightly different because we're 27 different economies. There's a welfare state that is completely different from what there is in the UK and in the US, actually. I think some of the social trends are more similar between the UK and the US than among European countries. So I think there's, there are two different sets of challenges, and so not exactly comparable. Where Europe has a real problem is in technological catch-up. It's behind China and the US. It's behind maybe the US and China, I should put it in that order. And it's not at all clear how it's going to catch up. At the moment, the US economy is doing well, but European economy is not doing well at all. So, where Europeans, so countries and the European Union are going to get the resources to make the necessary investments into technological innovation, green technologies, et cetera, is really not very clear, especially if nobody wants to pay taxes, because at the end of the day, it's about, what's coming into the budget and what's going out. So no, there's a bit of a negative predicament. Whereas I think the US in theory, economically, it seems to be working. So in theory, it might have a different story to tell in terms of performance of this model.
Rosa, just one point, if I may. The EU's now got its own economic security strategy, but I mean, is it sort of lowest common denominator? You picked up on the point about the 27 are in possibly different places.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because if you listen to the Commission, they've put forward all these legislative proposals, but a lot of them require implementation from the member states. And the economic security strategy in particular the document is littered with, we'll do this with the member states, we'll do it with the member states. So you have a situation in which you might get very uneven signing up to what the Commission is proposing from the member states. And ditto with the foreign investment screening mechanism. Not all the member states have signed up to it. So you have, in the EU, one of the problems is that in terms of economic governance, in terms of, you have a disjuncture between certain policy areas that are governed in a certain way, as if it were, close to a federation. And then you have other areas where the member states still retain a lot of power. And in the economic security or in the geoeconomics field, it all clashes, and it's the way forward is not clear. So I mean, I like to say we don't have a Jake Sullivan, not just because Jake Sullivan is particularly clear and brilliant in outlining his views, but also because we have 27 member states and a very cacophonous political landscape. So it's very hard to implement things in the same way. We have countries that are more protectionist than others, countries that want to see much more dirigisme and top-down management, countries that don't want Brussels to get involved, and all this is playing out, and it'll play out as well, following the European Parliament elections. To what extent will member states grant the Commission the competence to oversee these big projects?
Thanks, Rosa. Constanze, I mean, the US clearly, has made a very clear and unambiguous connection between, the sort of the domestic politics of geoeconomic change and, what's necessary in terms of, putting resources behind that. But I mean, is the relationship with allies, is that collateral damage, do you think, or is it something that the US has a clear sense as to how it wants to sort of connect what is the sort of domestic and political imperative to address these kind of questions with also a need to sort of keep allies on side?
I don't think it's fair to say that from a US point of view, the relationship with European allies is collateral damage here. I think one of the points in which and Rose is right here, a generally very sophisticated outlook on an interdependent world just hits the obvious contradictions and friction points. I mean, again, I think there is a truly remarkably broad appreciation of Europe's importance as a peer economic power in Washington, and of the importance of that in a context where what we are doing in attempting to support Ukraine is something that the Transatlantic Alliance has never done before, which is to explicitly refrain from using the military instrument directly and instead do what I would call counter-weaponizing Russian economic interdependence with the world through sanctions and export controls. That is something where the European Union is not just a supplier of boutique capabilities, as we were, say, in Bosnia, Kosovo, or Afghanistan, but where we are a peer power with not just substantial, which provides not just sort of addition to American leverage, but in fact is essential to American purpose, right? And that has given the Europeans and the EU and the EU Commission President a standing in Europe that we certainly didn't have in the Trump administration, but also didn't have before that. But that sort of runs afoul, as it were, of countervailing interests in the context of a trade policy which is very, very sort of pro-union, pro-labor, very protectionist, and at the same time is very concerned about constraining China's rise and China's influence or assertive or aggressive assertion of influence in Western spaces, including in America, right? That is where the friction arises. You saw that play out here, for example, in the desperate attempts of the Dutch to exempt their chip maker ASML from Jake Sullivan's small yard high fence policy, and they ultimately caved to American pressure, which is, I mean, and that is a case in point where the Americans showed that they are perfectly willing to play hardball with European nation states and key key European industries if they think their strategic purpose requires it. I'm not sure they're wrong. All I'm saying is there are, you know, this isn't a completely consistent picture, but I'm not sure that it could be.
Thank you. I want to come back to Ukraine, if I may, in a moment. But Simon, I mean, in this, you know, landscape, this new geoeconomic landscape, is the UK doomed to be the squeezed middle between the, you know, the US with its mighty financial firepower and a clear sense of what it wants to do, and the EU sort of nascent building of its own economic security approach?
Well, I think that is clearly a risk for the UK, and you can see it playing out in certain specific examples. So, for example, when the EU takes measures against subsidies for electric vehicles coming out of China, and the US also has such measures, the UK market then has to adapt or not adapt to that situation, otherwise it could be very exposed. So there are specific examples where it comes through. Similarly, the UK doesn't have the same sort of firepower as either the US or the EU when it comes to subsidies for clean energy development and those new technologies. So these are challenges. I mean, on the broader question, I think, you know, your question was, are these new challenges going to divide us? I think that we are sort of agreed on what the challenges are that we face. You know, we agree that, you know, we've got issues with China, we've got to deal with China, we've got to understand and respond to that. The climate and the consequences of climate change for our energy and indeed dealing with the consequences of climate change is a huge agenda. That new technologies, in particular generative AI, require international responses. That we face common challenges with migration and other things. I mean, we all agree on those challenges, but I think the problem is we're finding it more difficult to agree on collective responses to those challenges, because we are losing the habit of working collaboratively internationally through international organizations, which we invest confidence in and effort in. And also because we are finding ourselves therefore competing more overtly. I mean, we've always competed, but we've managed that competition through international organizations. The WTO is a very good example, which is now more or less ineffective. So that is problematic for all of us, and it is probably disproportionately problematic for the UK. And then for the UK, my question is, what is the sort of geo-economic strategy anyway? Because we have established new barriers between ourselves and our biggest market and our nearest market, with considerable and increasingly proven economic cost. Part of the argument, if you go back to the days before Brexit, part of the argument was that we were going to pursue new markets, notably in China and around China, and now we have a different policy towards China. So that market is no longer, in a sense, the sort of deus ex machina that it was. The new economic opportunities that we were pursuing through big trade deals, notably with the US and China, is not materializing, and those that we have pursued have not really demonstrated, you know, significant economic benefits. So there are questions for the UK, which is already challenged on competitiveness and productivity, as to where growth is coming from and where the markets are. And I think the government is right to sort of try and double down on specific areas of advantage or potential in the future, such as technology and AI, but our capacity to invest in those and to pursue them in ways that make us truly internationally competitive is a big challenge for the UK.
Thanks very much, Simon. Just an encouragement to those who are listening in that it's probably the final opportunity to get your points into Slido and your questions. I mean, Mark English's question on credibility and how big the UK's credibility problem is post-Brexit. I think we've rehearsed that quite a bit already, and he also begs the question as to how credible, or the credibility problems for the EU, which we'll come back to, because I want to sort of shift our conversation a bit, if I may, to have a look at the future, the near-term future. In your opening remarks, you all touched on the political cycle that we're in, that we're going to be seeing leadership change in the UK, in the EU system, and of course in the US. And one of the things I think that's marked the period since Russia launched its war on Ukraine has been this sort of convergence, even if there hasn't been equal burden sharing. And I really wanted to kick off and ask you whether you thought that Ukraine is one of the areas where there is the possibility for the most dislocation or the most difficulty on the sort of political cycle that we might be moving into, and therefore whether you sort of foresee problems there, but also anything else that you want to sort of flag up, perhaps to get your fellow panelists to have some reaction on, in terms of things that are keeping you awake at night, worrying about what's coming down the pike. So Rosa first.
Do you mean to say the degree to which Ukraine is going to affect the way people vote in June, Ukraine fatigue, or do you mean that the outcome of the vote could affect Ukraine, the European support for Ukraine?
I think I was thinking more that we've and it's often commented upon the degree to which there has been convergence, some of the the remarkable response in some capitals in terms of Ukraine. I mean, is that have we seen the high point really? Are things just going to get much more difficult now because of the political cycle and just where we are in terms of that conflict? And then are there any other things that go with that in terms of making the relationship, particularly across the Atlantic, more difficult, not just the politics?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I have to say, in terms of European publics, I've been really quite struck by the degree to which they have converged behind the official policy of supporting Ukraine. And at the beginning, it wasn't at all to be expected. I mean, there were, in several countries in the EU, there was a lot of skepticism, a lot of empathy with the Russian arguments that NATO, the West, the US, whoever had provoked Russia, and there was a lot of, and I think that angle is far less prominent in public debates at the moment. And I also don't see the connection between the support we're offering Ukraine and the more broadly, the need for defense spending, the cost of living crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's been quite a bit of resilience there. But what it does worry me, and this has come about especially in the wake of the European response to the Israel-Hamas war, and that is that there is a disconnect between elites and publics, and that disconnect, I think, in this case, has taken shape over this, which is a very existential question, not just for Israel, Palestine, but also for Europeans, and because of because of the history, and because of the communities that exist, Muslim communities, Jewish communities that exist in Europe. So there is this disconnect, and I think this is really what is driving a lot of the votes to the far right, that they don't trust our leaders, they don't trust our political parties, they don't trust, or there are large minorities that don't trust the leadership, and I think that will affect the vote in June. The vote is for the European Parliament, which means that translating that back into actual foreign policy decisions, it's not that immediate. It's not as if, it's not a national government. So if you go into, if the opposition comes into government, changes the foreign policy, that's not how it works in Europe. But it is likely to produce large groups within the even larger groups in the European Parliament that are Eurosceptic, that don't believe that the EU should be pursuing any foreign policy at all, that should be the prerogative of member states, countries that parties that don't want to see any more integration, and then of course add to that the usual anti-immigration, anti-Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, the usual list. Climate deniers, that's big. That's becoming a big topic actually in European in the far right, not just the far right. They're picking on sort of anti-climate politics. So I think that will be. So it's a little bit more diffuse than the Ukraine question, I would say, and that is going to play into the political cycle coming up. And then, of course, what we have, again, the elections in the Netherlands, if we have a government with Geert Wilders as prime minister, that adds on to the Hungarian government with Orban. Poland, still the new government hasn't been sworn in yet, hasn't been formed yet. There are going to be elections in Austria. So if you start adding up the number of countries in the European Council who can veto EU decisions, then it gets worrying.
To pick up on that point, it's how that it impinges then on the enlargement and the enlargement to Ukraine, because clearly, that's probably the most politically and economically difficult project that the European Union will ever have taken on, particularly, obviously, with respect to a third country. And it sounds to me as if the politics are going to make that very difficult. And how easy is it going to be for the sort of Brussels leadership to sort of sustain the momentum, and particularly to match what the expectations would be by Ukraine, but also, of course, across the Atlantic, where the US, has a great stake, even if it doesn't have a direct say in the pace at which the enlargement of Ukraine takes place.
Yeah, it's fiendishly complicated. It's a gigantic project which will require political energy over the years to come, but I don't think it's going to happen in the next 6 years, i.e. during the next commission. What will need to be done during the next commission, is that a decent, incredible, and an impactful enlargement strategy is put together, because the EU currently does not actually have one. And that you have the right constellation of political forces that can push it. Now, there could be some, well, there are two things to be said. The first is there could be some strange alliances, because there could be countries that are actually, there could be countries that are in favor of enlargement, but not in favor of deepening the European Union. So they could actually move the agenda forward, push the agenda forward, but in a way different, in a way that is intended differently, for instance, in Paris or in Berlin, where the focus is on EU reform. So you could have a sort of strange constellation of powers. There will be a lot of pressure, as you say, from the US, even from the UK. Ukraine's, the promise of accession came after the promise of accession to the EU came after the promise of NATO accession did not materialize. So, it is actually in the interest, there's a broader interest. So I think there are quite a few forces in favor of this actually happening. And I think there is enough logic for this to be pursued over time. And the other thing I like to think of, but I'm trying to be optimistic about it, because it is, a Herculean and a generational project of transformation. But I was thinking today, in 1993, June 1993, when the EU promised to expand to Central Europe, the EU was only 12 member states. They promised to over double in the course of just a few years, because then in 1995 you had Finland, Sweden, Austria join, and then 2004 you had 10 more countries, 2007 2 more countries, and then the final one 2013. So in 20 years between 1993 and 2013, the EU moved from being 12 member states to 28 member states. So it's doable, okay? You just it's hard to see how this could happen, but it is doable. And I think that will be, the big project of one of the big projects of the EU to come. And if it doesn't, I mean, there are fallback options, and I think Macron is basically imagining them already with an upgraded version of the concentric circles, which is a bit more of a sort of differentiated integration. So you do have a strong core, and then you have fuzzily defined areas of integration in which countries participate or not. And I actually think that I don't particularly like this model, but I think it might be a pragmatic way forward. And it might also be a way forward. We need to start imagining it not just to bring new members in, but also if certain members want to loosen their ties with Brussels, as some are clearly showing, or do not want the EU to have a foreign policy, well, then maybe they can take a step back. So imagine it a little bit in those terms. That is my sort of, where will we be 10, 15 years down the line story. It's a positive one, but the negative one is total fragmentation. I don't want to say dissolution because international organizations don't dissolve, but fragmentation and relevance is definitely a scenario there for the European Union if it doesn't manage to get its act together on these matters.
Thanks very much, Rosa. And I think, a good reminder that the EU's most powerful foreign policy has been its enlargement policy, and it's obviously going to be a major preoccupying activity. Simon, the EU is going to be focused on enlargement, possibly its economic security. I mean, what sort of space does the UK as a Euro-Atlantic power occupy? What is your thinking about, what would be sensible for the next government to think about doing, notwithstanding what might happen in the US? And I'll come to Constanze after you, if I may. Where does the UK sit? What's the UK going to be preoccupied with? Is the future going to be as difficult as the UK's recent past in terms of its foreign policy?
Well, I mean, a lot will depend on what happens in America and what administration we get, and secondly, whether we get a Labour government, and if that Labour government is actually capable in any meaningful way of improving the relationship with the EU, which it wants to do without putting anything significant on the table in relation to the customs union or single market membership. And therefore, back to my point of leverage, what's the offer from the UK in order to get that moving? But I really want to come back to this Ukraine point, because I think this is a big potential problem coming at us next year. And I think we are not sufficiently focused on the risks in Ukraine now, because it looks like it's a military stalemate. It looks like we are having an erosion of support potentially across Europe and in the United States, although that may not materialize, but clearly there is fatigue. There is a question about Ukraine's ability to sustain its position. And let's be serious about this. We could face a significant reverse for Europe, for Western European and American policy in Ukraine. I'm not saying it's defeat in a military sense, but a very significant reverse, given the amount of credibility and investment we have put into the Ukraine, our support for Ukraine. And I think we need to take that more seriously. And for me, that is a bigger strategic challenge for us than certainly I hope the situation in the Middle East will be, because I hope that the situation in the Middle East will be contained in the periphery of Israel and will not escalate. But a failure of our policy to succeed in Ukraine is a systemic and structural challenge to Europe. And you can talk about the enlargement of the EU to Ukraine as much as you want, but that is not going to be possible if we have a very significant frozen conflict on our hands in Ukraine. So let's focus on that a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Simon. Constanze.
I want to make 2 points. One, I think, and forgive me if I quote myself here, I think what we are still failing to recognize is that in Russia, we're dealing with an adversary who sees us as an enemy in the absolute term. The same is true for the hard right. The hard right in America and across Europe are enemies of representative democracy. separation and balance of powers, and the protection of minorities against the tyranny of the majority. That is literally the entire civilizational achievement of the West after World War II. That is at stake right now. That's my first point. My second point is that we have a year still as Europeans to not tip the balance in the United States, but what we can do is validate the Biden administration's bet on Europe. And we can validate it by not just sharing the burden of security in Europe, but by shifting decisively the burden towards Europe, which is, if my first point is true, what we ought to be doing anyway, with or without America. Thank you.
Thank you, Constanze. I think you sort of set us up for another discussion, or at least we could probably spend an hour picking those points apart. So thank you very much, and thank you to all three of you, to Rosa, Simon and Constanze, for giving your comments so generously and for putting a huge number of issues up for discussion. I'm not sure whether my glass is now half full or half empty after that discussion. I'm better informed, but I'm probably more depressed. So thank you very much for all of your input and your time. Just before we finish, a commercial break for upcoming events. Tomorrow evening, there's the final installment of the series that we've been running on the E3, and this takes place in a hybrid format at King's College and online, so there's still time to register for both of those options. And on Monday, we have an event with the Spanish Embassy on UK Spanish relations in the House of Lords, which should be a very interesting discussion, I think, when you consider the current state of relations. And then on Tuesday, the 5th of December, so that's next Tuesday, there's the conference on British politics, What Does the Public Think?, where there'll be new research from Rob Ford, John Curtis and Jane Green. And that conference is available for those who can be with us in person in Westminster. And lastly, but by no means least, on the 13th of December, we have the final Unlocked event of 2023 with Ross Atkins. So I hope you can join us for those, but my thanks again to Rosa, to Constanze, and for Simon for sharing their views and for such a stimulating discussion. Thank you. Goodbye.